Hi, and welcome to Penn Central 99's channel. I'm Terry, and this is the River Mountain Model Railroad. On this edition, we'll be making some wrapped lumber loads for freight cars. As you can see here, I'll be using a center beam flat for this project, but you can use it for other rail cars, such as just a regular flat car or a bulkhead flat. Now remember, this project is about wrapped lumber loads. It's not about weathering freight cars, which this one will be done at another time. This project is going to cover 4 areas of making the wrapped lumber loads. First of all, we need to take our measurements and convert them to scale. Secondly, we need to make the wood blocks for the lumber loads. The third one is we need to take the computer graphics and print the paper for the wrapping. And last but not least, we need to secure the wrapped lumber loads to the freight car. So let's go ahead and get started. In order to convert our measurements to scale, we need to know the dimensions of our wrapped lumber load. My loads are going to simulate 4x8 sheets of plywood that are 2.5 feet tall. So you can see here our length is 8 foot, our width is 4 foot, and our height is 2.5 feet. The reason I chose 2.5 feet is because this will give me 4 rows on each side of a center beam flat, which looks prototypical. So let's go ahead and take these dimensions and we'll go ahead and convert them to scale. To convert measurements to scale, I use an app on my iPhone from Woodland Scenics. You can see here Woodland Scenics app is called Model Scaler, and when I downloaded it, it was free. I don't know, you want to check, but if you don't have it on your phone, you might want to go ahead and download it because it's a pretty nice app. So you can see here you've got your actual item size, the scale, and the model size. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those measurements. So one of our measurements was 4 feet, and this project is going to be an HO scale. And you can see here that an HO scale, 4 feet in length, when we convert that to millimeters, gives us 14. So we know that our 4 foot dimension HO scale to millimeters is 14. So we're going to keep track of that number. So let's go ahead and change this one here, because we know that our other number was 8 feet. We're still an HO scale, and now our 8 foot measurement goes to 28 millimeters. We should have known that, because if you double the 4 foot, 14 millimeters is double 28 millimeters. So now lastly, what we need to do is we need to get our 2.5 feet in height, and you can see here a 2.5 foot high HO scale bundle is 8.759 millimeters. Now my ruler doesn't go down that low, so I'm just going to have to go with like 8.8 or 8.7 in order to cut that block of wood for that. I might want to scale it down just a little bit smaller to take up the difference in the thickness of the piece of paper that we're going to be wrapping it with. Now that we have our HO scale measurements, I went ahead and wrote them down on the piece of paper so I wouldn't forget them. Now before we go any farther, I want to explain the reason why I'm using the metric system. I believe in these smaller scales you can get closer to your true measurements using the metric system versus the standard system, because you can see how small the numbers are. Now as you can see here, 8 foot converts to HO scale at 28 millimeters, 4 foot is 14 millimeters, and 2.5 foot is 8.5 millimeters. Actually, if you remember from the previous segment, 2.5 foot actually converted to like 8.7 or 8.8, but to keep things simple, I'm just going to go with 8.5 millimeters to try and keep everything uniform and standard. So now that we have our measurements, I'm going to go ahead and turn to my bandsaw to make the actual cuts. I'm going to be using some scrap 1x3s that I found laying in the garage that I used while building the benchwork for the layout. Now it doesn't matter what you use, but I would strongly recommend using some wood that's serviceable, okay? And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be free of any warps, twists, cups, metal objects, since we're going to be cutting with it. It shouldn't be dry rotted, and there shouldn't be a whole lot of issues with it. Like I say, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be some usable lumber. And like I say, I'm using 1x3s that were left over from when I built the bench work for the layout. Before you start making your cuts, try and think about what you're going to do to try and maximize the use out of the piece of wood. So you can see here, this is our scrap lumber that we're working with, and this piece of wood is nearly 24 inches long, just under 24 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my 28 millimeter cuts lengthwise with the piece of wood. Then I'm going to make my 14 millimeter cuts with the width, and then my 8.5 millimeter cuts are going to be this way also. So like I say, just try and think about what you're doing to try and maximize the number of blocks of wood that you can get out of this scrap lumber. Before I set up the jig to run the 28 millimeter cuts, I need to clean up this edge here, because you can see how rough this edge is here. So I'm going to clean that up, that way I have a nice smooth, somewhat square surface to run up against that fence to make my continual 28 millimeter cuts. So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this through with my miter square so that I have a nice clean edge as I'm going through there. Okay, here's the shot from the back side of the bandsaw. I'll maybe give you a little bit broader view of what I just tried to explain. But you can see here is the fence that I set up, because like I say, we're going to be making multiple cuts, and I don't have to keep remeasuring stuff. Here's the spring clamp. There's also one on the other end. You can see the green tip of the handle. I just use that to hold it in place, because like I say, I'm going to be running this wood through at a pretty frequent rate to make all the cuts, and I just wanted to show you what the back side looked like before I went ahead and make the cuts. Safety is job one. Okay, first of all, when you're working with tools, whether they're hand tools or power tools, you need to have an understanding of what they're doing and what you're doing, so you don't injure yourself or damage the machinery. Safety glasses, okay, especially since we're working with wood, whether it's a circular saw or a bandsaw or a sander or whatever, you need to protect your eyes. Also, here's the port for the sawdust, so I'm going to be hooking up my shop vac to that port to capture the sawdust while I'm operating it. Okay, here you can see we have our fence set up at 28 millimeters, so I'm going to go ahead and start running that block of wood through there until I run out of pieces of wood. Well, you can see here we got quite a few blocks of wood out of that scrap piece of lumber. So now I'm going to take those and cut them down to the 14 millimeter size. Okay, so this is going to be our 14 millimeter cuts. Don't forget, measure twice and cut once. Well, you can see our blocks of wood are starting to take shape, and pretty soon, and before you know it, these will be some rack lumber loads. We got one more cut to make, which is our 8.5 millimeter. Okay, so we're getting down to our final cuts. You can see here, that's a 28 millimeter side. That's the 14 millimeter side. So this side here is the 17 millimeter, which if I cut it straight down the middle, I'm going to have my 8.5 millimeter blocks of wood. Now what I did to try and help eliminate the confusion is I have oriented the pieces of wood as to which way I'm supposed to make my cuts, because I don't want to, there's 80 blocks of wood there. So I'm just going to pick it up exactly the way it lays there and run it through the bandsaw without having to think about making 80 different cuts here. So I've oriented the wood as to how it's going to run through the bandsaw to try and eliminate the confusion, and I don't want to mess any cuts up at this point. Now we have some blocks of wood that are usable for our wrapped lumber load. So we'll go ahead and start with the next step, and that's getting the graphics together for the paper and the print so we can make these look like something. When doing the graphics for your lumber loads, I recommend using an Excel spreadsheet. The reason for that is the spreadsheet's already set up in rows, and all we have to do is format the row height to our particular lumber loads. Now, to get the sizes for our row heights, just go to the internet and go to a site that will convert, in our case, millimeters to inches. Now, if you remember, the height of our load was 8.5 millimeters, which converts to 0.33 inches. So what we need to do is come over here to our first row, set the row height at 0.33. Now the width of our lumber load was 14, and that converts to 0.55 inches. So we'll come back over here and set this row height to 0.55. Now we're just going to alternate 0.33, 0.55, 0.33, 0.55, 0.33 until we get to the bottom of the page. Now that we have our row height set up, we need to do a Google search for whatever graphic you're looking for. So since I'm doing 84 lumber, there's plenty of logos out there that you can pick. So I'm just going to copy that image. I'm going to come back over here to the spreadsheet and paste it. Now as you can see, that's a little bit larger than our rows, but all I got to do is format that row height in order for it to fit. Plus, the first row is going to be upside down, because if you remember, we have a front, a back, and a top that we just need to cut out and format. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill this row upside down until we complete it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the right side up row here, and we're just going to keep doing that until we have everything filled in. And once you're done, your spreadsheet is going to look like this: upside down, blank, right side up, blank, upside down, blank, right side up, all the way until you fill up the page. Once the page is full, you can just go ahead and print it, and we'll start to cut the logos out to paste onto the lumber load. Now that we have our logos on a piece of paper, we can go ahead and start cutting them into strips. So you can see here an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper is going to give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strips that we're going to be able to use to wrap our blocks of wood. Now for the cutting, I just use a piece of glass. I've got a piece of glass in the garage here that I use for cutting. It's a nice smooth surface. Plus when I use the X-Acto knife, not going to get any rough edges in there. Now I just take a metal ruler and line it up as close to the bottom edge as possible. Take an X-Acto knife, and we're going to cut this into strips. Now notice, using a piece of glass, I get a nice clean edge. I'm going to line this up as close to the bottom part of the logo as I can. Okay, so I'm going to keep cutting this off camera until I use up all the strips. Okay, I'm just going to use one strip to demonstrate wrapping one block of wood. I'm not going to show you how to do every single one of them because it's just going to be repetitive after that point. So we have our strip. Now we need to cut this strip down into smaller pieces in order to wrap our block of wood. Now to determine the size, remember that this is 8.5 millimeters high. So 8.5 and 8.5 is 17, and across the top is 28. So 17 and 28 is 45 millimeters. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this strip into 45 millimeter pieces, and then I'll show you what we're going to do next. Okay, so what I did is I just started at 1 inch and I measured 45 millimeters and made marks with a pencil. So now I'm just going to cut these into strips. And you can see we can get a couple of pieces out of this one strip here. Okay, so there's 4 usable pieces that we can use to wrap the load. What I do is I take my pencil and I mark this at, determine which is the best side to lay down, and then I mark this at 14 millimeters for my center. Flip this over. So this is 45, so that's going to be 22.5. I'll mark that in the center. That way when you go to glue it up, you can easily mark up the centers and make sure that you have enough to overlap that. To glue the paper onto the wood, I just use a simple glue stick. You can get this anywhere. So basically what you want to do, you take your glue stick, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the glue on this one edge here. Make sure that you cover the whole side with your glue. And now we're just going to line up the 2 center marks. Bring it as close to the edge as possible. And just hold it there for a couple of seconds. It only takes a couple of seconds to bond the paper to the wood. Once it's bonded, I'm just going to fold it over, just like wrapping a present, and crease it. You see the crease marks that I made there by doing that. Now I'm going to recommend taking your X-Acto knife and making a slit straight out from the corner, so that when you go to fold it over, you got a nice clean edge. So now that that glue is bonded, we'll go ahead and take our glue stick and put the glue on this edge here. I say make sure you cover the whole surface. And I'm going to put that back down on the flat surface and just fold it over. Hold it down for a couple of seconds. Once the glue has bonded with that, fold it a 3rd time, and like I say, crease that edge so you know where your corner is. Open it back up, take your X-Acto knife and make your slit straight out from the corner. Now we can go ahead and glue down that 3rd side. So go ahead and put your glue on there. You don't need much, but don't put it on there too excessive. So when I say we're going to hold that down. So now we just need to fold the edges or the ends in. And basically you're just going to glue these edges. So you don't need much, don't be excessive. And it doesn't matter which side you start on. Fold that over and fold that over. Fold this over. Now you've got a nice little package there. Same thing on the other end. I put the glue on the paper, on the ends, not the wood itself, because you can see how it folds over 3 ways. So when you fold that, and then fold that, there's a wrapped lumber load. Now just do that another 50 or 60 times and you'll have enough blocks of wood for one side of a center beam.
After cutting the blocks for the lumber loads, I had some thin strips left over, and they're going to come in handy for pieces of cribbing that go in between the blocks themselves. So as you can see here, cut these pieces into small strips to simulate cribbing, and what I did is I glued them onto the bottom of the blocks themselves. Now I did not glue cribbing to this bottom block because it already has supports or raised supports that are on the bottom of the car itself, but all the other ones are going to get these little strips glued to the bottom of them to simulate cribbing. To secure the lumber loads, I'm using some magnet wire. I picked up this magnet wire at Radio Shack before they went out of business, but I'm sure you could pick this up at any electronic supply store. But basically this magnet wire, because it's relatively thin, is going to simulate my cable. Now what I did here, and I put this on a dark background so you can see it, but I stripped off the insulation off the magnet wire, so I'm just left with the wire itself. But what I did is I used a number 80 drill bit and drilled in the top and the bottom to secure that cable. So now all I need to do is take that and feed that in the bottom hole here, and this is just for one side. So as you can see, I'm feeding it down through the hole. Now that I've got it started, I can go ahead and pull that through there and pull it tight. Straighten this up a little bit to try and give it that prototypical look of securing that lumber load. Okay, so I'm going to feed the wire in the top hole. Then I'm just going to bend that over to give me just a little bit of a secure point. Now even though I'm just bending this stuff over to secure it, I'm going to eventually secure it with like some contact glue or CA glue or whatever. Now I'm going to feed it in the bottom. Okay, it's fed into the bottom. And pull it through tight, just like the other side. Now all we're going to have to do is do this all the way down the side of the car to get the rest of our loads on there. I'm just going to try and tilt this around a little bit here to try and give you guys an idea of what this looks like. But this is the basic concept for securing these loads to the car. I'm just using magnet wire. I'm going to straighten it up a little bit instead of it being at an angle there. But you get the concept. Now to sum things up, the procedures that I showed you aren't the only way to do things. These are just the ways that work for me. You can look for other ways to do things, and you could actually figure out the things that work best for you in order to make these wrapped lumber loads for your center beam flaps. For those of you that are concerned with the weight of the car before the wood blocks was 4.15 ounces, and the weight of the car after the wood blocks was 7.4 ounces. So that's an increase of 3.3 ounces just for the wood blocks. Now according to NMRA standards for an HO scale car, that car should weigh 6.4 ounces. So I'm actually 1 ounce more than the NMRA recommendation for a weighted car. And actually, for tracking and to lessen the chances of derailments, a little bit more weight is better than a little bit less weight. Well, that pretty much does it for this edition. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. And as always, thanks for watching.